Thanks for tuning into the Chief Innovation Officer Summit. We really hope you're enjoying the content so far because we've got even more insights heading your way. All sessions are designed to be interactive and give you the chance to engage with our panelists and speakers, so come ready to get involved with your questions and comments. Don't forget to join the Innovation Alliance Slack channel to network with your peers. Now sit back and enjoy the content. Hello everyone and welcome back to the Chief Innovation Officer Summit. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our next panel. A couple of the panelists are running a little bit late, I'm afraid, but we've got 2 out of 4 here to kick things off. So I'm delighted to introduce Shannon Lucas, who is CEO and co-founder of Constellations, who's going to be leading the discussion today. She's going to be joined by a wonderful roster of panelists. I've just seen one of the slightly later ones joining now, so hopefully we will have a full house very soon, but it gives me great pleasure to pass over to Shannon to take it away.
Thanks, Heather. Happy to be here today. I'm Shannon Lucas. I'm the co-CEO of Constellations, as Heather mentioned. I have a long history in doing corporate innovation. I helped to build out the innovation program at Vodafone. I worked on Horizon 3 innovation at Cisco's Hyper Innovation Living Lab, affectionately known as CHILL. Most recently in the corporate world, I was executive vice president at Ericsson of Emerging Business. And I'm now an author of a book called Move Fast, Break Shit, Burn Out, The Catalyst Guide to Working Well. And I'm thrilled to have our panel here today. We have a juicy topic, so I'm going to jump right in. Hanna, if you could introduce yourself. She is the Global Head of Technology, Innovation and Ecosystems at the London Stock Exchange.
That is correct. And I'm actually joining for this call from New York. So in my role, I'm responsible for leading emerging technology strategy and kind of technology innovation strategy for London Stock Exchange Group, sitting within the CTO organization. So what I do a lot in this role is to understand what is actually happening with various different emerging technologies, whether it's public cloud, AI, machine learning, any kind of newer trends, like, for example, quantum computing or augmented reality, and then understanding those insights and kind of ecosystem players that then London Stock Exchange could be using either internally or visible for our customers. So kind of lots of different points there.
Lovely to have you. Thanks for joining. And Jordan, wonderful to see you. Chief Innovation Officer at the City of San Jose, and also an interesting background. Would love to hear from you.
Hi, Shannon. Thank you very much for having us here. I'm the Chief Innovation Officer for the City of San Jose. We are the 10th largest city here in the U.S. I joined the city during the pandemic, primarily motivated because of what's happening in the pandemic and the inequities that exist. So I really look forward to having this conversation today on this panel about trust and what we've learned here with technology in the civic space. I came from a prior background of starting out in finance, having spent time at both in sales and trading as well as in venture capital. Also then spent a few years as a diplomat as well as a military officer in the Army with tours in Taiwan, Japan, and twice in Afghanistan. And also then spent several years in healthcare, both on the medical technology side as well as digital health, where most recently I was CEO of a spin-out venture and director of venture development at Siemens. So love to have this conversation here today and look forward to a fruitful conversation going forward.
Thank you for all of your service. Thank you for taking the pay cut and going back into the public sector. I'm going to just do a little bit of a setup, because when we had this prep call with this panel, it was really interesting, actually, where the group sort of took the issue of trust. And so I wanted to just do a little bit of context setting. First of all, what do we mean by trust? And second of all, what is the state of trust in the world? Because I think it's important for us to get that. So the definition of trust is, it's defined as our willingness to be vulnerable to the actions of others because we believe they have good intentions and will behave well towards us. We're willing to put our trust in others because we have faith that they have our best interest at heart. They will not abuse us. They will safeguard our interest, and that doing so will result in a better outcome for all. Social trust is a measure of the moral quality of the society. of whether the people and the institutions are trustworthy, whether they keep their promises and work for the common good. As an example, when people in a church lose faith or trust in God or the church leaders, the church collapses. When people in society lose faith or trust in their institutions and one another, the nation collapses. I want to share some statistics from the definitive report on trust, which is the Edelman Trust Barometer. I highly encourage everyone to go look this up. It's super interesting. They actually started this as a direct response to the battle in Seattle, where I was living in 2000, when NGOs stormed the World Trade Center to protest globalization and an unfair distribution of wealth. Over the 20 years, they've studied how trust is won, how it's violated and lost, and they've learned that there are two essential elements of trust: the effectiveness and the ethical conduct. They're trying to walk an optimistic line in their latest report, which framed our current global situation as information bankruptcy, not the bankruptcy of trust. Interestingly, they found that trust is breaking down in our societies globally at record levels, with business becoming the only trusted institution, which is why it's so important for us today, followed in order by NGOs, government, and media at the bottom. Obviously, I'll call out social media companies have pretty low trust. Additionally, Edelman pointed out that business was the only institution to be considered both competent, so the effectiveness, and ethical. Business in general, however, just barely crossed the line into the category of trustworthiness, and they're now more trusted in government in 18 countries surveyed. I'll say for the Americans, according to the Edelman methodology, American business fell short too. Trust in American-based businesses from around the globe have never been lower in 21 years. Think about that for a second. While trust is breaking down around the world, if we look at the US, Americans don't trust business, they don't trust nonprofits, they don't trust media, and they don't trust they really don't trust their governments. And so while businesses are more trusted in general around the world, even as a resource for the pandemic information and providing safety, trust has been challenged. And this is sort of a pivot with a sharp increase in remote working, because the businesses are trying to ensure that the employees are remaining productive. And so they're breaking a lot of trust with those same individuals by over-monitoring. So that's the background. We have a lot to unpack, and I'm so happy to have these distinguished panelists. So why don't we start with you, Jordan? Given government's low ranking in the trust category, what can innovation leaders in government do to help restore trust in the social institutions? Especially, as you mentioned and why you joined, it's so critical during the pandemic and with all of the racial and economic inequality around the world.
Yeah, it's an interesting point that you mentioned, that government has such low level of trust. From a personal standpoint perspective, I feel like this has been decades in the making. And I feel like every generation that you talk to has a little bit less trust in government. When I joined the city, I was actually quite surprised at how often folks did feel mistrust, even for local government, whether you're talking about undocumented marginalized communities to other communities of color, who often felt, a certain level of unease when it came to government having access to that data, or government asking more questions that they felt comfortable answering. And I think to our detriment, trust, or what I really see it as a lack of understanding. And in part, when you have that, it's really on us. Maybe how did we not communicate well enough to bridge that gap of misunderstanding? But that's really also caused us to really reflect on, are we best serving communities when we decide to say, okay, let's admit that there is no trust and let's collect less data. And I think what we've seen actually is that, when you talk about equity, especially when it comes to racial equity and fighting some of the impacts of systemic racism, if you don't collect, let's say, race data, how do you actually know you're doing the right thing for the right communities? How do you know your resources and investments and services are actually going towards the right people and solving the right problems? And so, it's a catch-22 that we're in right now. I think a lot of other cities are in too, but part of that, I think a lot of it is just bridging that misunderstanding. Like local government, it's not just going to hand over a package of data to, let's say the INS or someone else to be like, hey, look, these are all these undocumented communities. No, that's not the point. I think most of us really care and come from the community and actually want to improve the current standard. So we need to do a better job communicating that's for sure.
And just to unpack that a little bit further, what do you see in your role as the Chief Innovation Officer, like from a technological or systems perspective? What can you do to start rebuilding the trust?
Yeah, I mean, part of it is really meeting sort of, no different than a business, right? Meeting your customers where they are. So at this point, meeting our residents where they are. I've been encouraging my team, even during the pandemic, to go out safely, to start meeting folks, where they are getting services, where there's a little bit more trust. We are now definitely going out more now that we're all vaccinated, to figure out, where are pockets of community so that they can put a face to government. And the third is, look, there's a lot of social media channels that remain untapped. I think some folks on the elected side have done well. Others are on the more bureaucrat civil service side have done okay at it as well. But just being on Twitter and Facebook isn't enough these days. You need to be monitoring your Reddit threads. You need to be, for that segment of community that's on Reddit. You need to be on TikTok for reaching out to Gen Z communities. I think we have to transform what we mean by digital comms, and really not just be hampered with the traditional early 2000s approach. So yeah, there's a lot of things that we can do, but a lot of it's actually in person. And the other part is leveraging the existing channels to reach new segments that otherwise aren't on the platforms that we're on these days.
I love the idea, even with government, about starting with empathy and connecting with your customers, as it were. I mean, it's, why design thinking is so popular. So thanks for sharing that. Hanna, I have a question for you. Since the 2008 economic crash and the global rising income inequality, there's a lot of trust rebuilding to do in the financial sector. What can innovation leaders in the private sector, but maybe even specifically in the financial sector, do to help restore trust?
Right. So obviously there have been, lots of activities, obviously from the regulatory perspective to start pulling together that framework and obviously introducing it, especially across the financial institutions and industry more widely. I think from our company's perspective, I think as we look at trust, it really comes back to the, trusted data, trusted infrastructure, and making sure that as our customers are using those kind of capabilities, so they know that this information is coming from the source with 300 years of history, and the information is well validated. So specifically, for example, from the news perspective, I think that has been obviously one of the key themes during past year. So getting the data from trusted sources like Reuters, for example, it is really, really important for our customers. And I think overall, one of the things that we have seen from the trust perspective is also being open, what are the practices that we use to collect the data and then offer them for our customers, overall with the open data approach in general. So I think those are the key themes that at least I've seen throughout the past couple of years.
And also digging in on that, do you see customers leaning into your open data approach, and how do you have those conversations and sort of accountability around that?
Absolutely. I think there's a kind of whole new set of roles that have been emerging recent years. Obviously, data scientists, looking to get access to different capabilities and data faster. And obviously specific developers as well looking at it the same way. So it's been massive demand in the market, and also kind of like bringing those communities together, that how do organizations like ours work with, for example, different technology firms, public cloud providers, and so forth. So really big demand there.
Good news. Thank you. Ori, welcome to the conversation. I'd like to introduce you quickly. He wears many hats, including the Chief Innovation Officer at the Institute for Population Health at King's College London, although he is now in Connecticut. So we have two UK organizations based in the New England area. I gave a little bit of background, as you might have seen, around where the global state of trust is right now. And so from your perspective, I think your perspective and your background right now during this sort of global public health crisis crisis is super interesting. What role do innovation leaders have in capitalizing on, I mentioned a statistics about the employers are kind of the highest trusted right now in terms of information sources, which is really interesting. At the same time, they are also sort of, they're trusting their information, but not necessarily high trust in keeping them safe in terms of frontline workers or coming back to the office. And, you know, Michelle Williams, who's the dean of Harvard Chan School of Public Health, suggested that maybe companies need to think about having chief public health officers. Do we need to go that far? And what's the role of organizations in the pandemic?
Yeah, I think, first of all, apologies for being a few minutes late. I was having technical difficulties on my end, and thanks for having me today. Working backwards, there were a bunch of questions in there. Do companies need to have chief health officers or chief digital health officers or something like that? I guess it depends on the size of the company to a large extent. And I guess it depends on what you are looking for that individual or department to actually do. If you're asking me whether companies should pay attention to things like the mental health of their employees, absolutely. Whether that sits with HR or chief people officer or, you know, chief success officers, I've seen it. It's immaterial. The title is immaterial. Companies should absolutely be paying attention to the well-being, physical and mental well-being of the people who work with and for it. And companies that don't, people shouldn't work for them, to be perfectly honest, is my perspective. Over the past year and a half, obviously, with the global crisis around population health and individual health, what we've seen is a lot of the things, the trends, the ideas, the deficiencies, the systematic deficiencies that have been there for years just come to the surface. I don't think COVID has really dramatically changed anything, actually. I just think it accelerated processes that were already there and exacerbated or brought to light issues, deficiencies, challenges that were already there. And in that sense, that I guess that is a silver lining to what otherwise is a horrific, horrible global pandemic. So I think, you know, in terms of specifically around the area of trust, what I would say is there's more of a call. We're seeing a lot more of a call for clarity, which is challenging, right? Medicine and specifically population health, contrary to popular belief, is actually not an exact science. So different people are going to have different opinions, and different research is going to come up with different conclusions and different hypotheses. So getting clarity is really, really important. And then I think evidencing obviously everything in the scientific process is cardinal to everything. But then there's an entire layer of communications and meeting audiences where they are and adjusting your communications interventions to what will work for the public, rather than taking kind of the ivory tower approach of, you know, this is what we think will work, let's shove it down their throat. That, you know, we've known for decades that doesn't work, and you know, COVID has shown us again and again and again that really doesn't work and can actually be incredibly destructive. If you're trying, for example, to convince a population of individuals who are incredibly resistant to taking the vaccine, you might have a much, much higher chance of doing that through community engagement, through community leaders, religious leaders, than you will by showing them the DNA and RNA statistics of how a vaccine works. So those are all components that we've all learned and integrated in the past year that I think are really, really meaningful. And if we're smart, we're going to integrate them moving forward. And if we're not, we're going to see the same challenges repeat over and over and over again.
It's so interesting. There's a couple of things in terms of what you just said. So LinkedIn has a chief mindfulness and wellness officer. And he was talking in one talk about how, you know, in the 80s, employers started to learn that physically healthy employees created let's say cynically, lower medical expenses for the company, but also on the productivity side made people more productive. And there's this sense, even before the pandemic, with all of the peer review things that we have about mental health, about how companies are starting to lean into that. So I think it's interesting that the pandemic has allowed us to put that more in the forefront, to think about the employer's role, which is a trust building exercise. It's like, I'm actually looking out, if you missed the definition, but social trust is about looking out for everybody's well-being and getting better outcomes together, right? I do want to double click on your thing though, because, if business is the most trusted sort of worldwide, and not that trusted even in America, just you brought up the issue of the vaccines. Like, what do you see is the role of maybe local governments, like, and Jordan, maybe you and Ori want to comment on this, of building that trust, and how do we get there as a society, both from the business perspective? And so, Ori, why don't you go first, and then Jordan, I'll let you respond.
Yeah, I think actually Jordan is in a better position because he's in it. We work a ton with cities, and city administrations and mayorships. I think evidence shows that in areas where vaccine activities, whether it's distribution, education, engagement, have been done at the localized level and as localized as possible, even within cities, break things down to neighborhoods and wards and those types of things. The further you can break it down, the more successful it is, because you're not treating the population as a single cohort, right? As and you're able to tailor your activities, your engagements to the things that will matter and the things that will create engagement, interest, and resonate with local populations. So I think the cities and urban environments have a tremendously important role. Everywhere where we've seen the national level take command, distribution of vaccines has been significantly slower. And this should be a good lesson for us. I think organizations and urbanists have been talking about the importance and the rising importance of the urban environment and the city environment for decades. This is just another great example of how important and the transition that we're all going in societies, as I think 70% of the global population now lives in large urban environments or close to it. People don't or increasingly identify themselves less and less as American or English or French. They identify themselves as Parisian or, from Madrid or Barcelona or from, New Yorkers or San Diego's in some obscure cases. Sorry, Jordan. So I think that's, there's a lot of learnings there. And I would say that wherever possible, the localization of all these things is probably the best way to go.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned localization and segmenting your users. I think that's something that when we talk about building, products and putting on a product management mindset to thinking about, doing better communications and marketing campaigns. These are all things that I think often government doesn't do well enough in terms of truly segmenting. And it's not just by race, it's by race and then by and then by age and then by gender and then by, and on and on and on, right? And it's like, so, but for government to do that, often a lot of governments have a very low ad spend budget, if non-existent. Some of them are precluded, if you're in certain elected official capacities. And so you deal with this dilemma of one being drowned out by industry, one being drowned out by other not-for-profits that have larger ad spend capabilities, and third, actually being drowned out by local media. And so, and whether the local media is hostile or with you is to be debated. But that is something that you have to face as a reality. And so I think there's a lot of struggles when it comes to segmenting or creating segmentation practices because people then ask, like, so what? So what if I do that? I don't have any resources to take action on that. And so we need to have kind of a mind shift in how we think about launching initiatives, launching products, building products from 0 to 1. And I'm really excited in the future of where city government goes, because I think the pandemic has really made us cross-functional, has really put the emphasis on building trust and better communications and getting access to communities. I think now, to Ori's point, we just have to explain why, right? So when we do talk about data equity, we explain why we're collecting this information. Why are we collecting information about your race? And the important part is like, yeah, we want to make sure that the offerings, let's say in community scholarships and stuff, are tailored to your specific demographic. And that the money is actually going to where we say they're going, and that we're actually making improvements in solving, let's say, for poverty or low education or graduation rates in specific targeted communities. And if you fill out this information, I guess it's true in industry too. Like, hey, you actually get a better experience. Well, I'm not trying to like cloak and dagger. Like, you will get a better experience because we will know exactly who needs what. So.
I think it's super interesting. And I come from the generation, I'm going to date myself here, but like my first online community was The Well, which was out of San Francisco and came from the whole Stuart Brand thing. And there was this utopian ideal to speaking to Jordan, what you said, which was like there was going to be this openness, and also to what Hanna was talking about, like this openness of data and this place where all the different sectors of society could come from, which makes me pivot to like the mass adoption, but widespread distrust that has largely, I would say, been incurred because of the presence of the social media companies and the dwindling trust. Even though most people are actually getting their news there, they also don't trust the news there. And so I have a question to you guys about like, what's the role as a chief innovation officer in any of these organizations, public, private, educational, to sort of combat? I mean, I think that one of the things that you're talking about is if the Wells vision of the trajectory had actually borne out, people would trust information more. But instead, we've actually gone back the other way. So how can we combat some of the social distrust that these and I would add, you guys are talking about like micro comms. So like, is there a way to get sort of the micro directed communications to the stakeholders that you're trying to engage? And Hanna, I'll pass it on to you. Like, what's your view of that?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I was just looking at like, there was I think Apple had a release where they had an option for people to kind of switch off the tracking of the applications that they are using. And I think most users actually chose not to be tracked at all. So I think from the kind of like individual users perspective, I think that acknowledgement that, obviously specifically tech companies and, as you say, social media companies, how they are, tracking information about you. And I think that whole discussion about individuals' ownership of his or her data, I think is becoming much more prominent. And again, like having that open approach around it. I think what I'm seeing more and more is that also that I think the data conversation is also moving to the actual technology conversation as well. So, for example, when we look at application of artificial intelligence on top of the data, or machine learning and so forth, we're seeing the same kind of trends there as well, where the regulation is coming into play. I'm thinking, for example, the European Union regulatory proposal for AI applications that is coming into play, and that then kind of again forces companies to look at it again and seeing that how the models are really implemented. And I think that's where the kind of the diversity angle will come into play as well, that as you have data, as you start adding the AI and machine learning models on top of it, you need to make sure that the data will be equal. So I think it's kind of overall is in a way a process, and it's about like communicating that process and again being like transparent what is being done in this environment.
I think you bring up a really good point, and Tim Cook's sort of fight with Zuckerberg about like what, who's going to stand on what side of the data privacy or the transparency at the very least. And it is interesting how people are leaning in. Jordan, did you have other thoughts about that?
It's interesting. I would say, I'm kind of stuck right now in terms of all these battles that are going forth. I think in some ways, I am curious. Even with maybe more accurate surveys, are governments actually reflecting what people care about and doing the things that people actually care about or want to care about? And so often I see these conversations being hyper politicized around more baseline values that politicians tend to represent. And I think when it comes down to it, it sometimes, unfortunately, comes down to whether you support big corporations that are foreign to you Do you support your own national champions? And if not, then what's your other stance? And so I think there's a lot of pressure that is being muddled around things like emerging technologies, whether it be AI, ML, or whether we haven't even gone to. I'm surprised we weren't talking about quantum more. But what worries me is that, are we actually making the decisions that are based off of specific cases, or are we tying in larger things? And it's just a knee-jerk reaction. It's playing on emotions. So I'm not saying either or, for or against. I'm seeing it from that side, and so we've been hesitant in some ways to say, like, I am for or against a technology, but rather let's have a framework to better understand it first. And so when it comes to things like surveillance tech, when it comes to things like our digital privacy policy that we pass, it's about building the capacity to better understand versus just being values-based in discussion.
I think that's really smart. And Ori, I'll pass this to you, because I think I'm glad that the next place I was going to take us was the AI conversation, because I think that one is easy for people to understand. We can talk about quantum if we want, but from all of the different sectors that are looking at these types of technologies, how do we, and I think you're spot on, Jordan, there's an education component that is a more neutral place first, and then you can align sort of after you understand a little bit about it, then you can start to get into the values-based conversation after that, because there could be a lot that technology could do for good, including AI and ML and healthcare. You guys all know the story about how Watson failed terribly because the doctors either had confirmation bias or they're wrong either way, right? So Ori, how do we engage with the population to help them understand some of the technologies and then develop their own trust relationships based more on fact rather than the hyper-politicized sort of starting point?
I think it depends on who's engaging. If you're the public sector, look, I think study after study after study show that people are perfectly happy giving up a very serious degree of their information, as long as there's a relationship of trust, which is what we're here to describe or discuss, and critically, a value that they receive back in some way, shape, or form. That value doesn't have to be monetary. It can be better services. It can be, if I, tweet to the city or to 311 that there's a pothole here, it gets fixed faster. That's value, right? So for public sector organizations, even academia, I think that there's a real opportunity to leverage the fact that they don't have a transactional relationship with the public and their stakeholders, and that the relationship is one of services, right? Go back to Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the social contract. We are all giving a certain amount of liberties away in order to live in a well-functioning society. That is the basis of the modern, society in which we live. And that cannot and should not really be broken. I think organizations, public sector organizations, need to continually think about that, evolve that, and be very careful. Jordan, this answers the question that you raised earlier around, okay, we have all these things that we need to do, but we don't have the funds, we don't have the capabilities. More and more we're seeing PPPs, right? Public-private partnerships rise up. So public sector organizations need to be super, super careful about how they construct those partnerships and make sure that the data that is sometimes gathered in initiatives that can be sponsored or supported by private sector organizations that have all the technology, all the personnel, the information doesn't actually end up there. So put that aside for a second. If you're asking about the private sector, the construct is completely different. As somebody who's been at a large social media company that went through, I saw it before, during, and after the IPO, I can tell you that things can start off beautifully and very ideal, in a very idyllic way, and with the best of intent. As soon as a company goes public, there is a switch. There has to be, by nature. It is no longer about the purpose or the missions. It is about the quarterly earnings call. And it's very difficult, and very few companies are able to do beyond that and step above that. And when you're talking about the private sector, the construct, right, the dynamics, the actual system and the way that it works is designed against the protection of the individual, the stuff and data ownership by the individual, and all the stuff that Hanna was talking about, because the individual is, the product. They are not the customer, and their data is incredibly valuable. And under that construct, whether Facebook sells, I'm not picking on Facebook specifically, but you mentioned Zuck earlier on. So whether Facebook sells your data, or whether it puts ads in front of you, or whether it provides your information to an insurance company so they can better understand whether you are more or less likely to get sick in the next 3 years, which they do. That's where things get incredibly, I don't know if that's the right term, but iffy, and difficult.
So Jordan, let me bring it back to you just to round out this question. I from my technology background, rolling out things like 5G could be really controversial to, different parts of society, communities, et cetera. It's just one example about, what is the role of, and let me say, even as we watched, basically the big 5 billionaires march in front of Congress, was that last year? There is a question I have in my mind even about what the responsibility of government is to first understand the technology, because it's a big leap if you're a representative with a different background to be able to legislate on it, but then to help people understand sort of that baseline so that they can develop the trust in the technology and then make their decision about not in my backyard for different reasons.
Yeah, it's interesting with the NIMBY movement, but and we see that with a lot of other issues related to social, not just technology. I think the big interesting thing is what we've done with 5G is really try to say, look, it's a technology that's inevitably coming. I think people who have made arguments about radiation or other safety concerns, I mean, they made the same about when it came to 4G, when it's 3G, iPhones, you name it. There's all this conversation around there. I do think that from a healthcare standpoint, from a public health messaging standpoint, it's probably the FCC, and we've talked to their advisors and they've listened to us like, hey, look, maybe y'all need to do a little bit more on just educating the public, on 5G when it comes to public health and all the conversations around that. But where we've really taken a stance with 5G is, look, as part of this rollout, that inevitably the telcos are going to do it. How do we best make sure that our marginalized communities aren't left behind, so that this 5G technology and the networks that are built are not just going towards, high LTV CAC ratio zones or neighborhoods, that they also are being offered to other communities that might not have a high willingness to pay. But the other part is to make sure that, we ensure that, one, the redlining isn't there, but also that we create economic benefits, socioeconomic benefits beyond just for private industry. And so we've actually created the Digital Inclusion Fund that accelerates the deployment of 5G permitting for the small cells. But by doing so, we take a portion of those economic gains and we invest in bridging our digital divide. And so I think when people think about the digital divide, they think about broadband speeds, right? Inevitably, I think the biggest thing about this 5G argument is that, guess what? When 5G is here, your broadband speed definitions are going to be radically different based off of the future of device usage as well, and consumer patterns. So we need to make sure that our lower income neighborhoods and BIPOC communities aren't being left behind when it comes to learning, when it comes to access to information, when it comes to building their own business, and access to media. So that's something that we're trying hard to steer in a more equitable way.
I think that's a really interesting pivot on the conversation, because democratizing access to the technology is a first step in terms of getting the diversity of people actually using the technology and influencing it, which you could argue for AI. Like if you only have one demographic creating AI, you get these built-in biased assumptions. Hanna, what is the role of the Chief Innovation Officer in bringing that diverse and inclusive access to the technology and making sure that it's benefiting more than just one segment of the population?
Yeah, I think I'm very mindful about that topic, actually. So I think, obviously, we as an organization, we're looking at obviously a wide range of different emerging technologies. And figuring out the ways that we can implement them on our side to our technology stack, or obviously specifically for our customers. And I think one thing, as I mentioned earlier, is really that as we look at, for example, AI implementation, so we have organizations of data science teams and developers, which are then responsible for building kind of additional analytics on top of our data. So that we are very mindful of the ways that we are doing that and making sure that the development that we are doing is equal, and we think it from the get-go rather than afterwards. So that's really, really important. And I think overall, accessibility question is quite interesting one, obviously more outside the financial services industry, because I think people also do have more access to kind of emerging technologies than ever before. So you can easily log into any of the public cloud website and start getting access to the basic capabilities. I think there's lots of kind of free education out there as well that people can start using. I think obviously with COVID as well, like throughout last year, we saw that all the very expensive cloud conferences were suddenly available for free for anybody to join. So I think there is that kind of like positive momentum from that angle. But obviously, as we start looking at kind of individual citizens, I think there's still that challenge that if I think about from the personal experience of how difficult it is to fully understand that how your data is being used at the moment. So if you start going to the those kind of Facebook settings and figuring out that, okay, like I want to switch off some of the features, it's actually kind of surprisingly difficult to do that. So I think there's still some more work to be done in general to make sure that it's kind of simple enough to anybody to understand.
Shannon, you're muted.
We just have a couple more minutes, so if there's any more questions, we have two from the audience, so we'll do kind of a lightning round. So Ori, if you can answer this in 1 minute, you see the question there, but you mentioned that people are happy to give away their data in exchange for value. How can orgs prove the value ahead of the delivery of the initiative? Like how does the user know that it has value before they give up their rights to their data?
We've been as institutions and organizations and companies been convincing people for hundreds of years to do things before we provided them with the value. So let's deploy the same tactics that we have always deployed in terms of sales, marketing, communications, but deploy them for good instead of for selling people crap they don't need. So I mean, there's no need to reinvent the wheel here. Good storytelling, demonstration of value, understanding of your customers, clearly defining what are their needs and wants and where can you deliver meaningful value that aligns to what they need will work wonders. And not overselling, being honest about what you can and cannot do.
The super specific piece of meeting them, they mentioned like an older demographic, and that's what Jordan's been saying, like really understand that specific customer. Jordan, question for you. Do you collaborate and share pain points, challenges and wins with other cities in California or nationally, maybe even internationally?
Yeah, we do. We're part of several groups, from the Bloomberg cities to, working within the Knight Foundation to our mayor, Sam Liccardo, is head of the Big Cities Mayor Coalition here in California. And so, yeah, we do a lot of, cross-pollination, but I would also say, look, no city is the same, and uniquely, where San Jose is positioned is also very, very interesting. And so often we do share. What I would like to see more from my colleagues is sharing more of where we failed, and being more transparent about that. But it's hard. I work for an elected official, right? As you all know how that all works. So, but I would like to see a little bit more of that transparency there from my colleagues.
Shannon, just to note on that, if anybody on the call is seeking more examples of cities that do well, Jordan just mentioned Bloomberg, so I actually also am a part of the Bloomberg organization. So if anybody has any questions, for example, we work with dozens, if not hundreds, of cities around the world across these types of solutions. So if anybody has any questions that I can be of help with, just say the word.
Well, we could have unpacked, that was just the jumping off point to a whole nother conversation about failure and being vulnerable and building trust, but we're out of time. I just want to thank you for the amazing conversation, everyone. It's obviously very topical today. Hopefully the audience got some stuff out of it. I think all of us would love to see you on LinkedIn or social, and have a great afternoon. Enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you so much, Shannon. Thank you so much to our fantastic panelists. It's been great to have you. And yeah, like Shannon said, please do connect with Ori, Jordan, Shannon, and Hannah on LinkedIn. But thank you everyone for tuning in, and thank you for sharing your wisdom, our fantastic panelists.
Thank you.
Until next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you.